The mysterious knock. David had never liked the rain. It always made his small apartment feel colder, lonelier. Tonight was no different. The heavy downpour rattled against the windows, creating a rhythmic but unsettling sound. David sat on his worn-out couch, staring at the flickering television screen. The news anchor's voice droned on about rising gas prices, but David wasn't paying attention. His mind drifted as he sipped the last bit of his lukewarm coffee. Just as he placed the cup down, a soft knock echoed through the room. David froze. It was late, past midnight. No one ever knocked on his door at this hour. He glanced at the clock. 12:23 a.m. Another knock followed, this time a little louder but still hesitant. Who could that be? He muttered, standing up. His apartment building wasn't exactly the social kind. Most neighbors kept to themselves. The only person who visited him was the mailman, and he definitely didn't deliver at midnight. Approaching the door, David hesitated. Should he even open it? His hand hovered over the handle as another knock came, softer now, almost pleading. Curiosity won over caution. He unlocked the door and pulled it open slightly, just enough to peek outside. There she stood, a woman drenched from head to toe, with strands of long dark hair sticking to her pale face. Her eyes, deep and glowing faintly, met his. David's heart skipped. There was something different about her. She wasn't just beautiful, she was otherworldly. "Please," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the rain. "Can I come in?" David opened the door wider, unsure why he was doing it. She looked harmless enough, terrified, actually. Her clothes were strange, a long silver coat that shimmered slightly under the hallway light. "You're soaked," David said awkwardly, stepping aside. "Come in. I'll get you a towel." She nodded, stepping inside carefully, as if afraid to leave wet footprints on his floor. David grabbed a towel from the bathroom and handed it to her. She smiled, a faint, almost apologetic smile, and wrapped the towel around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, sitting carefully on the edge of his couch. Her eyes wandered around the room, pausing at his bookshelf and the blinking router light, as if these things were foreign to her. David sat across from her, not sure what to say. "So, are you lost?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze shifted to the window, watching the rain cascade down the glass. I don't know," she said at last. Her voice was soft, but every word felt carefully chosen. David frowned. "You don't know." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't mean to be here." "Here as in this neighborhood." Her glowing eyes flickered toward him. "Here as in this world." David stared at her, waiting for some kind of clarification. A joke. A laugh. Something. Nothing. "Okay." David leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. "I see." The woman tilted her head slightly, watching him as if studying his reaction. David sighed. Maybe she was just confused, or had been through something traumatic. He didn't want to pry. "Look, you can stay here for the night," he said, gesturing toward the couch. "I don't have much, but I can give you a blanket." Her eyes softened. "Thank you, David." His hand froze midair. "I didn't tell you my name." A faint flicker crossed her face. "You didn't have to," she replied quietly. David felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to brush it off. Maybe he had mentioned it earlier, and he just forgot. The storm outside grew louder, and David stood to grab an extra blanket from his closet. As he pulled it down, a strange light reflected off the wall for a brief second. David turned sharply, but nothing was there. When he returned to the living room, the woman was already asleep on the couch, the towel draped over her like a makeshift blanket. David stood there for a moment, watching her. She looked peaceful now, but something about her felt unexplainable. As he reached for the light switch, she stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep. David couldn't make out the words, but one thing was clear. They weren't in English. He shut the light off and went to bed, But sleep didn't come easily. The woman's voice echoed in his mind. By morning, David's life would never be the same. Stranger in the room. The rain hadn't stopped by morning. Gray clouds hung low, and faint sunlight barely managed to seep through David's curtains. The soft patter of raindrops filled the silence of his small apartment. David lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind hadn't let him rest. The woman, whoever she was, still slept soundly on his couch. He could hear her faint breathing from the other room. David sat up slowly, careful not to make too much noise. His curiosity gnawed at him. Who was she? Why had she appeared at his door in the middle of the night? And why did she say she wasn't from this world? Shaking his head, David pulled on a sweater and stepped into the living room. There she was. The woman hadn't moved much. Her long dark hair cascaded over the armrest, and the towel had slipped to the floor. David hesitated, wondering if he should wake her. But there was something peaceful about her now. She no longer looked afraid. David quietly made his way to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of instant coffee. As the kettle hummed, he found his eyes drifting toward her again. She didn't seem real. Her skin was too flawless, her features too sharp, like someone had painted her into existence. The faint glow in her eyes from the night before had faded, but it lingered slightly under the surface, as if waiting to emerge. David took a sip of his coffee and leaned against the counter. He didn't know much about strangers, but he could tell when someone didn't belong. And she didn't. Suddenly, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, David swore they shimmered a faint shade of silver. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples as if waking from a long dream. "Good morning," David said, breaking the silence. She looked over at him, her gaze soft but curious. "Morning," she replied quietly. David shifted awkwardly. "Oh, how did you sleep?" The woman smiled faintly. "Better than I expected." David nodded, unsure of what to say next. He decided to just ask the question burning in his mind. "So, are you going to tell me what you meant last night?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was trying to remember the exact moment. "You said you weren't from this world," David continued. Was that just a metaphor or something?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced around the apartment, studying it as if it were the first time she had truly seen it. Her gaze lingered on the bookshelves, the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, she met his eyes. "I didn't lie." David lowered his cup slowly. He expected her to smile, to laugh, to reveal it was some sort of misunderstanding. But she didn't. Her face remained calm, serious. "Okay." David exhaled, placing his coffee down. "So, you're saying you're from another planet?" The woman tilted her head slightly, almost as if she was trying to find the right words. "Not exactly," she replied. "Your world is one of many. I come from one. Further away." David raised an eyebrow. "Further away?" She nodded. "You wouldn't know the name." David ran his hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it. "So, you're telling me you're an alien?" The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "That's what you would call me, yes." David stared at her, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. "You don't look like an alien," he said, crossing his arms. "Would it be easier if I did?" she asked gently. David paused. "I guess not." A strange silence settled between them. David's mind raced with questions, but he struggled to form the words. Finally, he sat down across from her, leaning forward slightly. "Why me?" The woman blinked. "What do you mean? Why my apartment? Why knock on my door in the middle of the night?" David's voice softened. "There are thousands of places you could have gone, but you ended up here." She lowered her gaze, her fingers lightly tracing the fabric of the couch. "I didn't choose," she said softly. "I had no time." David frowned. "No time." She hesitated, but eventually spoke. "I was being followed." David's chest tightened slightly. Followed? By who? Her eyes flickered toward the window, as if expecting someone to be standing there. They are dangerous, she whispered. They come to take what isn't theirs. I escaped, but not for long. David felt a chill run down his spine. Are they still looking for you? She nodded, meeting his gaze. Yes. David leaned back, running his hands over his face. This wasn't just some lost woman. This was something bigger, something he didn't understand. You can leave, the woman said suddenly, breaking his thoughts. I won't stay long. I don't want to cause you trouble. David looked at her for a long moment, her calm but tired eyes searching his. Finally, he exhaled. No, you can stay. At least until the rain stops. The woman's expression softened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely grateful. Thank you, David, she said, her voice warm. David forced a small smile, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Whatever had knocked on his door last night wasn't just passing through. It was only the beginning. The chase begins. The storm had quieted by afternoon, but the clouds still hung heavy over the city. The air felt thick, and David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest since morning. The woman, she still hadn't told him her name, sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the street below. She barely moved, except for the occasional tilt of her head, listening to sounds David couldn't hear. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but his gaze kept drifting back to her. She was too still. Finally, David couldn't take it anymore. What exactly are you waiting for? He asked, setting his phone aside. The woman didn't answer immediately. Her fingers lightly traced the foggy window pane. They're close, she said softly. David's brow furrowed. Who's close? She turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw something behind her calm eyes. Fear. I told you, she said quietly. The ones who followed me. David stood up, pacing slightly. All right, but who are they? What do they want? The woman's gaze drifted to the floor. Control. Power. It's always the same. David stopped. You're saying they're after you. Because of power. She nodded. I have something they want. Something I can't let them take. David frowned. His apartment suddenly felt too small, as if the walls were closing in. He walked to the window and looked outside. Everything seemed normal. People walked along the sidewalk. Cars splashed through puddles. But then he saw it. Across the street, partially hidden under the awning of a cafe, stood two men. They weren't doing anything suspicious, just standing there, but something about them felt wrong. David narrowed his eyes. Their clothes were too crisp, their movements too rigid. One of them glanced up and locked eyes with David. David instinctively stepped back from the window. Is that them? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't need to look. Yes, she replied. David exhaled sharply. Great. So now what? I'm not exactly equipped to fight off secret agents or aliens or whatever they are. They aren't here for you, she said calmly. They're here for me. David's jaw tightened. Yeah, but you're in my apartment. Doesn't that kind of make it my problem? The woman smiled faintly, but the warmth didn't reach her eyes. You can let them in, she said softly. Tell them you don't know anything. They'll leave you alone. David stared at her for a long moment. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the quiet resignation. No, he said firmly. I'm not doing that. The woman's eyes widened slightly. You knocked on my door, David continued. I'm not just going to hand you over. A flicker of something passed over her face. Surprise, maybe even gratitude. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. David's heart leaped. The woman's expression hardened instantly. Don't answer it, she whispered. David stood frozen, staring at the door as if it might break down at any second. Another knock. Louder this time. David swallowed. What if they know I'm home? Won't it seem suspicious if I don't open it? The woman stood and moved closer to him. If you open it, You won't be able to lie. They'll know. David stared at her. How would they know? Her gaze met his, steady and unblinking. They'll hear your heartbeat. David's throat tightened. Fantastic, he muttered under his breath. The knocking stopped, but David knew they hadn't left. He could feel their presence lingering on the other side of the door. The woman gently touched his arm, her voice softer now. Thank you for not opening it. David nodded stiffly, but his heart was racing. A few tense minutes passed in silence. David stood by the door, listening intently. Eventually, he heard faint footsteps retreating down the hall. They're gone, he whispered. For now, she replied. David slumped against the wall, running his hands through his hair. This is insane. I'm just a regular guy. I wasn't supposed to get involved in whatever this is. The woman knelt down to pick up the fallen towel from the floor, folding it carefully. You're involved now, she said quietly. David exhaled and nodded. Yeah, I guess I am. But as he stared at the door, he couldn't help but feel like this was far from over. And he wasn't wrong. Secrets revealed. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. David sat on the edge of his couch, nervously tapping his fingers against his knee. The woman sat across from him, perched near the window, gazing out as if expecting the shadows to move at any second. They hadn't spoken much since the knock at the door. David's thoughts raced. Who were those men? Why did they care so much about this woman, this alien, sitting in his living room? All right, David said at last, breaking the silence. His voice felt too loud in the quiet room. I need answers. You can't just sit there and expect me to play along. I let you in, but now I need to know what's really going on. The woman slowly turned to face him, her glowing eyes, faint but noticeable now, locked with his. I understand, she said softly. David leaned forward. Good. Then start from the beginning. Who are you really? The woman hesitated for a moment, then stood and walked closer to him. The way she moved was almost too graceful, like she was gliding rather than stepping. I told you the truth, she began, her voice steady but calm. I'm not from this world. I come from a place very far from here, beyond what you would consider your solar system. David narrowed his eyes. All right. And why are you here? Of all places, why Earth? Her gaze softened slightly. I didn't choose to come here. I was forced to. David's fingers tapped faster. Forced by who? The men who were at the door. No, she replied. By them, but not just them. There are more. A group. They call themselves the Collectors. David frowned. Collectors. She nodded. They take things that don't belong to them. Artifacts. Knowledge. And people like me. David's stomach tightened. So, you're saying these guys are some kind of intergalactic bounty hunters? The woman smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Something like that. David ran his hands over his face. Okay, so why are they after you? The woman's expression grew more serious. Because I have something they want. A piece of technology that I stole from them. David's eyes widened. You stole from them. That's why they're chasing you. I didn't have a choice, she said quietly. The technology wasn't theirs to begin with. They took it from my homeworld, and I took it back. David exhaled sharply, leaning back against the couch. Okay, this is starting to sound like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. The woman lowered her gaze. I understand how it must sound to you, but I assure you, it's very real. David studied her for a long moment. There was no trace of deception in her eyes, just exhaustion. He sighed. All right, let's say I believe you. Where is this thing you stole? The woman hesitated, then slowly reached inside the silver coat she had been wearing since the night before. Her hand emerged with a small, smooth object no larger than a marble. It glowed faintly in her palm, emitting a soft hum that vibrated the air around it. David leaned forward, mesmerized. "What is that?" "This," she said softly, "is what they're after." David stared at the marble, feeling an inexplicable sense of awe. The light inside it seemed to shift and swirl like liquid. "What does it do?" he asked. The woman's eyes flickered. "It holds the key to something powerful. A doorway of sorts." "A doorway to what?" She hesitated. "To places that shouldn't be opened." David's mouth went dry. "Okay, now you're just making me nervous." The woman closed her hand around the marble, and the hum faded instantly. "That's why I can't let them have it," she continued. "If they unlock that doorway, it won't just affect my world, it will affect yours too." David swallowed hard. He glanced toward the door, half expecting those men to return. "So, what's the plan?" he asked finally. "You can't just stay here forever." The woman's expression darkened. "I know. I only need to stay hidden for a short time, long enough to find someone who can take this back where it belongs." David's head tilted. "Someone? Like who?" Her gaze lingered on him for a second longer than necessary. "No," David said immediately, holding up his hands. "No way. If you're thinking about dragging me into this interstellar manhunt, forget it." The woman smiled faintly. "I wouldn't ask that of you." David crossed his arms. "Good, because I'm not exactly hero material." "You already helped me," she replied softly. "More than you realize." David opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. The woman's expression hardened instantly. She pocketed the glowing marble and stepped away from the window. David stood slowly, feeling his pulse quicken. The footsteps stopped. A faint shadow shifted beneath the door. "They're still here," David whispered. The woman nodded. "They won't leave until they find me." David clenched his fists. "Then what do we do?" She looked at him with quiet determination. "We prepare," she said, "and when the time comes, we run." Bonds formed. The apartment felt smaller as the hours crept by. David couldn't stop pacing, his nerves fraying with every distant sound from the hallway. The woman, who still hadn't offered her name, sat calmly by the window, her gaze fixed on the empty street below. David finally stopped near the kitchen, rubbing his temples. "You're way too calm about this," he said, glancing at her. She turned slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Panic won't help." "Yeah, well," David huffed. "I think I'm doing enough of that for both of us." The room fell silent again. David opened the fridge, half-heartedly grabbing a bottle of water, but his appetite was gone. He leaned against the counter, staring at the woman across the room. She was strange, no doubt. Not in an obvious way, but in how she carried herself, how she spoke. There was a quiet confidence about her, yet her eyes betrayed something else. Something deeper. David finally broke the silence. "You haven't told me your name." The woman blinked, as if the question had startled her. She hesitated. "I'm called Area," she said softly. David repeated it under his breath. "Area. Okay. That's a start." He took a sip of water and glanced toward the window. "So, Area, how long do you think we got before those guys come back?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes shifted toward the front door, as if calculating something. "They're searching the area," Area said. "But they won't linger for long. If they don't find me soon, they'll move on. At least for a while." David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "That's not exactly reassuring." "I didn't say we're safe," Area replied gently. "Only that we have time." David set his water bottle down and crossed the room, sitting on the opposite side of the couch from Area. His knee bounced restlessly. "I don't get it," he said after a pause. "Why are you trusting me with all this? I'm just some random guy. I could have turned you in by now." Area's gaze softened. "But you didn't." David let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, and I'm still not sure why." She tilted her head, watching him closely. "You could have closed the door that night, You could have left me outside in the rain. David shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. I guess you just looked like you needed help. Arya smiled faintly. That's rare, David. Many would have chosen differently. He frowned, unsure of how to respond. There was something strange about how she said his name, like it carried more weight than he understood. A moment passed before David spoke again. You said earlier, that thing you're hiding can open doors, right? Arya nodded, her expression growing more serious. Where exactly do those doors lead? David asked carefully. Arya hesitated, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the couch. To places that aren't meant for most to see. Some lead to other worlds, but others lead to places far darker. David's grip tightened on his knee. Darker how? There are things out there, Arya said quietly. Creatures. Forces that shouldn't be disturbed. The collectors want to control that power, but they don't understand the danger they're inviting. David swallowed hard. Great. So if they catch you, we're not just talking about alien tech. We're talking about monsters. Arya's silence was all the confirmation he needed. David exhaled, slumping back against the couch. I really need to start locking my door. Arya chuckled softly. It was the first time David had heard her laugh. It wasn't much, but something about it eased the weight in his chest. If only for a moment. You don't regret it, do you? She asked suddenly. David met her eyes. I don't know. Maybe I should, but I don't. They sat in silence, the distant hum of the city filtering through the window. Finally, David stood. I'll grab you a blanket. You can stay on the couch tonight. Arya watched him quietly. Thank you, David. He nodded, heading to the closet to pull down an extra blanket. As he returned, he hesitated for a moment before draping it over the couch beside her. Get some rest, David said. I'll keep an eye out. Arya smiled softly. You should rest too. Tomorrow will bring more questions. David smirked. Yeah, I'm getting used to that. As he turned off the lights and retreated to his room, David felt something shift. For the first time since Arya arrived, he wasn't just protecting a stranger. He was protecting a friend. The final confrontation. The night pressed down heavily on David's apartment. The shadows seemed thicker, stretching unnaturally across the room. Arya sat by the window, her silhouette barely visible against the faint glow of the city outside. David couldn't sleep. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening for the faintest sound in the hallway. It had been hours since the last knock, but the tension lingered like a storm refusing to pass. A sudden shift in the air made him sit up. It wasn't a sound, more like a feeling, as if the room itself had tightened. David glanced toward the window. Arya was no longer sitting there. His heart jumped. Arya? He whispered, but the room answered with silence. David stood, scanning the dark corners of the apartment. His eyes flicked toward the front door. It was still locked. The window hadn't been opened. Then he saw her. Arya stood on the balcony outside, her face turned upward toward the night sky. David exhaled in relief and quietly slid open the balcony door. What are you doing out here? He asked, stepping beside her. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the stars above, as if searching for something far beyond his understanding. They're coming, she said softly. David's stomach twisted. How do you know? Arya lowered her gaze, her glowing eyes meeting his. I can feel them. David ran a hand through his hair. All right. So what's the plan? We can't stay here forever. Arya looked toward the horizon. We won't. Before David could respond, a sudden flicker of light caught his attention. Across the street, a black van rolled slowly to a stop beneath a flickering streetlight. Two figures stepped out, their movements sharp and deliberate. David's breath caught. Is that them? Arya nodded. David took a step back, panic rising. Okay. Time to go. Right now. They'll see us, Arya said calmly. David turned to her, exasperated. Then what are we supposed to do? Wait until they break down the door. Aria's gaze softened, but there was a sadness behind her eyes. Trust me. David clenched his jaw, his instincts screaming to run, but something about the certainty in her voice anchored him in place. The two figures crossed the street slowly, their heads tilting as if scanning for signs of movement. They're not human, are they? David whispered. No, Aria replied quietly. David swallowed hard. Of course not. The figures reached the front of the building. One of them glanced up, directly at David and Aria standing on the balcony. David's pulse spiked. They see us. Aria stepped forward, raising her hand slowly. A soft hum filled the air, and the marble she had shown David earlier began to glow faintly in her palm. The figure below tilted its head, as if confused. Then, without warning, it turned and began walking toward the building's entrance. They're coming up, David said through gritted teeth. Aria closed her eyes. The glow in her hand intensified. David watched as the air around them seemed to ripple, bending and twisting like heat rising from asphalt. The balcony itself shimmered, and for a brief moment, David felt weightless. When he blinked, they were no longer on the balcony. They were standing on the rooftop. David stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. What? How? I moved us, Aria said simply. David stared at her. You moved us. She nodded. David glanced over the edge of the rooftop. Below, the two figures stepped into his apartment, the faint creak of the door echoing in the night. David's heart pounded as he watched them silently move through his living room. One of them paused, tilting its head unnaturally toward the ceiling. They know we're close, Aria said quietly. David took a shaky breath. Okay, so what happens now? We just sit here and hope they give up. Aria turned to him, her expression calm but firm. No, we confront them. David stared at her in disbelief. I was hoping you'd say run, but sure, let's fight the interdimensional bounty hunters. Aria smiled faintly. They aren't as invincible as they seem. They rely on technology I understand. David shook his head. I hope you have a better plan than just showing off glowing marbles. Aria stepped closer, holding out the marble in her hand. As David watched, the light within it shifted, expanding into a swirling pattern that almost resembled a key. This will disrupt their connection to this world, Aria explained. But I need time to use it. David exhaled sharply. All right, what do I do? Aria's gaze met his, and for the first time, David saw trust in her eyes. Keep them away from me, she said softly. David laughed nervously. Great. I'll just distract the alien bounty hunters while you save the world. No pressure. Aria placed her hand gently on his shoulder. You've already done more than you know. David looked away, feeling his chest tighten. Let's just get this over with. A sudden crash echoed from the floor below. They know, Aria said, gripping the marble tightly. David took a step forward, squaring his shoulders. Then let's give them a reason to leave. The goodbye that changed everything. The rooftop was eerily quiet. The cold wind swept across the empty cityscape, carrying with it the distant hum of streetlights flickering to life below. David stood near the edge, staring down at his apartment building, watching as the two figures searched the rooms beneath him. They moved with mechanical precision, silent, efficient, inhuman. Behind him, Aria knelt near the center of the rooftop, the glowing marble in her hands casting soft light onto her face. Her eyes were shut, and her lips moved silently, as if speaking words that David couldn't hear. They're leaving, David whispered, watching the figures exit his apartment and disappear into the black van across the street. The vehicle glided away, swallowed by the night. David exhaled, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Aria opened her eyes. The marble's glow dimmed until it was no brighter than a candle flame. For now, she said softly. David turned to face her, crossing his arms. So, that's it. They're just gone. Aria's gaze lowered. They'll return. They never stop for long. David rubbed the back of his neck. Great. I guess that means I should start looking for a new apartment. Aria smiled faintly, but there was sadness behind her eyes. You won't have to. David frowned. Why not? Aria hesitated, standing slowly and stepping toward him. The wind tugged at her silver coat, but she seemed unaffected by the cold. Because I won't be here when they return, she said quietly. David's chest tightened. Wait, what do you mean by that? Aria's gaze softened as she met his eyes. I can't stay, David. The longer I'm here, the more danger I bring to you, to your world. David's mind raced. He should have expected this. She wasn't from here. She didn't belong in his small, ordinary life. But hearing the words out loud hit harder than he thought they would. Where will you go? He asked, his voice quieter than he intended. There are places I can hide, Aria replied. But not for long. Eventually, I'll need to return to my world and face what comes next. David shifted uncomfortably. And the marble? What happens if the collectors get it? Aria's fingers curled around the glowing object. They won't. He studied her for a long moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, he broke the silence. You could stay, you know. I mean, maybe not here forever, but at least for a while. Aria smiled gently, but the sadness never left her face. You're kind, David, but some things can't be outrun. No matter how far I go, they'll follow. David laughed nervously, trying to mask the heaviness settling in his chest. Well, if they show up again, I'll just tell them I don't know any glowing-eyed aliens. Aria's smile grew, but her eyes shimmered faintly as if holding back something deeper. You're more than you think you are. David chuckled. I'm really not. I'm just a guy who forgot to lock his door. Aria stepped closer, and for a moment, David felt as though the space between them disappeared entirely. You didn't forget, she whispered. You chose to open it. David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Aria gently placed the marble in his hand. The warmth of it pulsed faintly, like a small heartbeat. Hold on to this for me, she said. David's eyes widened. Wait, you're leaving this with me. Aria nodded. It will be safer in your hands. They won't sense it as easily if I'm not near it. David looked down at the glowing object, unsure of what to do. I don't know how to protect something like this. You already have, Aria replied. David met her gaze. How will I know when to give it back? Aria's expression softened, and she placed her hand over his. When the time comes, you'll know. He searched her eyes for reassurance, but all he found was quiet certainty. A faint hum filled the air, and the space around Aria began to shimmer, the edges of her form blurring slightly like ripples in water. Wait, David said quickly, stepping forward. That's it. You're just leaving. Aria paused, the shimmering light around her flickering softly. You'll see me again, David, she said. I promise. David's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, but deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. Before he could say another word, the light surrounding Aria brightened, and in an instant she was gone. David stood alone on the rooftop, the marble's faint glow the only trace she had ever been there. The city stretched out before him, silent and vast. The collectors were still out there, somewhere in the shadows, but David wasn't afraid. As he closed his hand around the marble, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe he wasn't just an ordinary guy after all. And maybe, just maybe, he'd see Aria again, under the stars where their paths first crossed.